We're tackling a subject that, well, it seems like humanity's been obsessed with forever. Calculating the exact end of the world.
It's a morbid fascination, isn't it, trying to pin down the final date?
Totally. And if you listen regularly, you know Le Podcast de Philippe loves a good mystery. So today, yeah, we're digging into these specific end-of-world theories.
The calculated ones specifically.
Exactly. Not just vague feelings, but predictions based on numbers, texts, even complex computer models. We're using sources summarized for us by Notebook LM, which is super helpful.
Yeah, the goal today is really to look past the sort of fuzzy prophecies. We're focusing on the attempts to use actual calculations, modeling, historical cycles.
To put a hard number on global collapse.
Right.
It's like trying to impose order on ultimate chaos.
Precisely. It's about that human need for predictability, even for the end times.
Okay, let's get into it then. Before we had, supercomputers in the 70s, people were still trying to find the date using specific numbers or texts.
Oh, definitely. And some of the figures involved might surprise you.
It wasn't all fringe elements, right?
Not at all. I mean, take the year 1666. The panic around that in Europe wasn't based on some comet.
No. What was it then?
It was pure numerology, essentially, tied directly to the number 666 in the Book of Revelation, the number of the beast.
Wow. Okay. And you mentioned even rational figures got into this.
Absolutely. Isaac Newton himself, father of classical physics, he spent a huge amount of time on esoteric research.
I did not know that.
Yeah, digging into the Book of Daniel, biblical chronology. He actually calculated the end of times would be around 2060.
Based on scripture, not gravity.
Exactly. He was using textual interpretation, trying to map out a sort of divine timeline.
That's fascinating. And this method, interpreting texts like Daniel, it was influential elsewhere too.
Very much so, especially in religious movements. The Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, use their interpretations of Daniel and other scriptures to predict several specific dates.
Which ones?
They pinpointed 1918, then 1925, and later 1975, each time based on these detailed scriptural calculations.
And sometimes the calculations were more personal. I remember the Paco Rabanne thing.
Oh, the fashion designer, yes. He announced quite publicly a major catastrophe for August 11th, 1999.
Based on?
His own kind of unique, let's say, personal system. Not scientific, not strictly religious interpretation, just his own calculations. It shows how these things can just pop up in culture.
And then there was the big one, the Mayan calendar scare.
Right. December 21st, 2012. That was probably the most famous recent example based on calendar cycles.
But that was a misinterpretation, wasn't it?
Mostly, yes. It was the end of a major cycle, the long count, in their incredibly sophisticated calendar system. Not necessarily the end, more like rolling over the odometer.
Okay, so those are mostly historical or text-based. But you mentioned some other calculated dates still out there, something about 2026.
Uh-huh. Heinz von Forster, a scientist, predicted human extinction around November 13th, 2026. He called it a demographic singularity.
Demographic singularity. What does that actually mean? Sounds intense.
It is. He used equations modeling population growth. Extrapolating them forward, he calculated that on that date, theoretically, population growth would become infinite.
Infinite. How?
Well, obviously not literally infinite, but reaching a point where the system breaks. Essentially, extinction caused by sheer numbers, by us overwhelming the planet's resources and capacity, overcrowding ourselves out of existence.
Okay, that's sobering. But this brings us to the 1970s, right, when things shifted dramatically.
Exactly. Computers enter the scene. Suddenly, we're moving from interpreting ancient texts to trying to mathematically model the entire world system.
That sounds like a massive leap. How do they even approach that?
Through a technique called system dynamics. It's basically mathematical modeling for really complex issues where everything affects everything else.
Right. You mentioned the deer population example. Simple inputs and outputs.
Precisely. You have a stock, the number of deer, then flows births add to the stock, deaths subtract. You tweak variables, like food or predators, and see what happens over time.
Simple enough for deer, but the whole planet.
That's the huge leap the MIT team took. They were commissioned by this elite group, the Club of Rome, in the early 70s.
The Club of Rome, I've heard of them.
Yeah, they wanted to know about the limits to growth. So the MIT researchers built this computer model called World 3.
And what did World 3 track? You can't track everything.
No, you can't. They had to simplify. They focused on 5 core global factors, things they could quantify and link mathematically.
Which were?
Okay, they looked at population increase, agricultural production, the depletion of non-renewable resources, industrial output, and pollution generation.
All interconnected, I suppose.
Tightly. So a drop in resources hits industry, which then affects agriculture, which impacts population, and so on. It's all linked in feedback loops.
And the big prediction from World 3.
Wasn't the end of the planet itself like an asteroid hitting? It was the collapse of human society, our economy, our system.
And they put a date on that.
Roughly, yes.
Huh.
They predicted this collapse would likely occur around 2040, but crucially, they said the first signs, the initial stresses, would become visible around 2020.
Right around now.
Pretty much.
So, okay, the model predicted collapse, but how? What were the specific ways things could fall apart according to World 3?
They ran different scenarios based on potential human choices. The first and most famous was Scenario 1, business as usual.
Meaning we just keep doing what we're doing.
Exactly. No major policy shifts, no radical new tech saving the day. In that scenario, what hits first is running out of non-renewable resources.
Like metals and fuels.
Yep. Once those deplete significantly, industrial output just collapses. You can't run factories without energy and materials.
And the knock-on effects.
Mass unemployment, a sharp fall in food production because modern agriculture depends heavily on industrial inputs, and eventually population decline because of widespread starvation.
That's grim. And didn't someone recently check how we're tracking against that scenario?
Yeah, that was quite startling. In 2020, an analyst at KPMG, Gaia Harrington, looked at the World 3 data and current trends. Her conclusion was that we were, broadly speaking, still on track with that original business-as-usual collapse trajectory from the 1970s.
Wow. So a 50-year-old model might still be relevant.
Yep.
That's unsettling, regardless of who funded it initially. Shouldn't we be paying serious attention?
Well, it definitely caused a stir. But the MIT team didn't stop there. They asked, what if we find way more resources? What if technology bails us out?
Okay, good question. Scenario 2.
Scenario 2 was basically business as usual too, but they doubled the assumed base of non-renewable resources in the model.
So resource depletion happens later.
It does run down more slowly, yes. But the problem shifts. With resources less constrained, industrial growth continues unchecked for longer.
Needing to.
Massive system-breaking pollution. In this scenario, the collapse isn't triggered by running out of fuel, but by pollution overwhelming natural systems and human health.
So you get poisoned instead of starving.
Essentially, yes. The model showed pollution attacking agricultural land, reducing food yields, and directly harming people. Collapse still happens, just driven by pollution and related health crises and hunger.
It seems like growth itself was the problem in the model. What about super advanced technology? Did they model that?
They did. Later updates, like one in 2000, included a comprehensive technologies scenario. It assumed major advances in efficiency, pollution control, resource discovery, agricultural yields.
Basically,
Much. And even then, the model still showed industry overshooting planetary limits and then collapsing, though food levels might recover somewhat afterwards. The core message remained. Constant, exponential physical growth on a finite planet leads to collapse.
So was there any scenario where collapse was avoided?
Yes, just one. But it was, let's say, politically charged.
How so?
The only way World 3 avoided collapse was through a fundamental shift in global priorities, moving away from maximizing industrial output and economic growth.
Towards
Social welfare, stability, and equality. It required deliberately controlling industrial production, stabilizing population. The model showed you could achieve a stable state, kind of an S-curve leveling off, maybe around 2014 if policy started early enough.
But what kind of policies are we talking about? How would that even work globally?
That's the catch. It required all nations simultaneously shifting their focus from GDP growth to things like health, education, and environmental protection. It implies a massive level of global coordination and governance.
So the math basically concluded that avoiding collapse requires, essentially, a world government controlling industrial output. That feels less like a neutral finding and more like a specific political vision.
It certainly has those implications. And one of the Club of Rome's founders, Dr. Alexander King, even acknowledged it. He said achieving that level of cooperation would require a gradual diminishing whittling away of sovereignty.
Okay, context is key here, because didn't the Club of Rome already believe collapse was imminent before they commissioned the MIT study?
That's a critical point raised in the sources, yes. They had already reached conclusions about the dangers of growth, which fairly raises questions about potential bias.
Like, were they looking for a model to confirm what they already thought?
It's the classic issue of funded research bias. We see it all the time, right? The tobacco industry funding studies showing smoking is fine, sugar industry funding studies downplaying sugar's role in health issues.
Money talks, basically.
Often it does. Recent analyses show something like 70% of food industry-funded studies tend to produce results favorable to the sponsor's products. It doesn't automatically mean the research is wrong, but it means you absolutely have to ask, who paid for this? What was their agenda?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Putting aside the politics of World 3 for a moment, how does the scientific community generally evaluate these kinds of predictions today? What makes one credible?
Well, there are pretty standard criteria. First, clarity and precision. A vague "doom is nigh" doesn't count. It needs specifics.
Okay, what else?
Plausibility. Does the prediction actually align with known scientific laws? You can't just invent new physics to make your prediction work.
Makes sense.
Then, tangible proof or evidence. Is there any real-world data supporting the mechanism or the timeline? And maybe most importantly, is it testable? Is it falsifiable?
Meaning you have to be able to prove it wrong.
Exactly. If someone predicts the world ends on date X, and date X passes peacefully, the prediction is falsified. It failed the empirical test.
And that's the ultimate rebuttal for so many of these calculated dates, isn't it?
Yeah.
1666, 1999, 2012.
They came and went. Life went on. Reality invalidated the specific prediction.
Even the World 3 timeline seems off in retrospect, right? They predicted widespread famine by 2000.
Yes, that specific prediction didn't pan out. In fact, the data since the 1970s shows the opposite in many ways. Global hunger, while still a massive problem for millions, has actually dramatically reduced overall.
And other metrics.
Global life expectancy is up significantly, about 11% since the model was published. Infant survival rates are up by something like 70%. So the specific dire outcomes predicted for the turn of the century didn't materialize on that schedule.
But you noted the underlying pressures are still there.
The pressures regarding resource use and pollution are absolutely still relevant areas of scientific concern, yes. The timing and specific outcomes in the model were debatable, but the core concept of limits is still discussed.
And now there's even a kind of counter-narrative emerging, isn't there? Something that challenges the fundamental assumption of World 3.
That's right. The original MIT model was heavily driven by the assumption of continued exponential population growth pushing us beyond Earth's limits.
But that's not what we're seeing everywhere now.
No. In many developed nations, and increasingly in developing ones, birth rates are falling, often below replacement level. So many demographers and economists now argue the biggest global problem in the coming decades might actually be population collapse.
Demographic implosion, the opposite of the explosion predicted in the 70s.
Exactly. Caused by choice, by changing social factors, not by famine or disease. And if that trend holds, it fundamentally alters the core dynamic that drove the World 3 collapse scenarios.
So we started this looking at precise dates calculated for the end of the world. We've seen historical ones fail, computer models predict timelines that didn't quite match reality, although they highlighted real system pressures like resource use and pollution.
Which are still very real concerns, yes.
Right. So considering all this, the failed dates, the model critiques, the potential for demographic shifts, what's the takeaway for us, for the listeners? Should we keep looking for the date, or is the focus shifting?
That's the big question, isn't it? Maybe the obsession with a single specific doomsday date, whether it's 2012 or 2060 or 2040, misses the point.
And the point is,
perhaps the focus should be less on hitting some predetermined expiration date and more on managing the complex long-term risks, environmental, social, economic, that science has identified, even if the precise timing is uncertain or keeps shifting. It's about navigating the ongoing challenges rather than bracing for one specific calculated endpoint.
a really interesting thought to end on. Managing complex risks versus waiting for a calculated date.
It shifts the perspective quite a bit.
It certainly does. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating, sometimes flawed history of calculating the apocalypse.
My pleasure. It's a complex topic.
It really is. And to you, our listeners, if you found this discussion valuable, please do help Le Podcast de Philippe reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. We're really close, and every follower share makes a difference. Thanks for tuning in.